George Adamson, grand old man of Africa, hunter turned conservationist, whose name will always be linked with the lioness Elsa and the film Born Free. He lives in Kora, in the remote northeast corner of Kenya, one of the last great wildernesses of the world. George Adamson has spent most of his life in the wild, listening to the lions roar. Now in his 80s, he is still Lord of the Lions. Grow, who's 12, is the matriarch of George's pride of 8 lions. Their relationship is very close.
Jenny, look, yeah, look, come on.
But her daughter One Eye is much less friendly. George thinks she may have been attacked by tribesmen.
Come on, Jenny, look. Come on.
2 miles south of the equator, at Campi, Simba, the camp of the lions, George Adamson leads the life of his choice, woken by the kiss of the sun and the sounds of the African bush. These lion cubs, the first George Adamson has had in his keeping for many years, were sent to him by the Wildlife Department after their mother was shot for killing cattle. To an old man who's endured many vicissitudes, they are a breath of youth and hope. Above all, they bring back memories of Elsa and her cubs. But they also present George with a challenge, for one day they too will have to be returned to the wild. The daily ritual at Kora begins with George feeding the guinea fowl.
The curious thing is they always go around in a circle. I become quite dizzy watching them. And they're always in anti-clockwise direction. I don't know whether that's got something to do with the south of the equator, or maybe north of the equator they'd go the other way. When I was a game warden on safari, I more or less lived on guinea fowl. Well, I can't very well feed them and then shoot them. Although at times they're so infuriating with their noise that I feel like putting one in a pot.
The marabou storks are always around.
Yes, well, they always hang around to see what they pick up. You know, the marabou, their beaks, they can't tear flesh. And they had to wait for a vulture to tear a piece of meat off, and then they pinch it off the vulture. Look. We get the yellow-billed hornbill and the red-billed hornbill. And they're absurdly tame and they come here and they love peanuts. And the thing about them is that they're the most wonderful catchers. If you could train them to have a cricket team, make a cricket team, I think it'd astonish everyone. Too damn lazy. The rabbit monkey. They're very gentle. The most prominent thing, of course, is a bright blue testicle. All creatures are welcome here, apart from scorpions and venomous snakes. They're the two I won't tolerate. In 1887, it was presented to my father.
George's father, Harry Adamson, worked in India for the Raja of Dholpur, first building the Raja's railway and then reorganizing his army. George and his brother Terence were born in India, educated in England, but later went to Kenya with their father.
When he retired, he decided to go and settle in South Africa and then chose Kenya.
What did he plan to do in Kenya?
Well, he bought a coffee plantation, and we to start with growing coffee.
But George didn't care for coffee farming. What he really enjoyed was big game hunting with his brother Terence, shooting the odd elephant and selling the ivory. Then in 1934, he tried gold prospecting, lured by the legend of the Queen of Sheba's mines, said to exist in the middle of a desolate volcanic desert on the shores of Lake Turkana, a vast inland sea 170 miles long in the far north of Kenya. The Jade Sea, as it's called, was the setting for perhaps George's greatest adventure. He and his friend Neville never found the end of the rainbow, nor the Queen of Sheba's gold. By the time they'd walked halfway round the lake, under a blazing sun, they were exhausted. No white man had ever crossed the lake before, but Neville suggested building a boat. George thought he was off his head, but agreed.
All our food ran out. We hadn't got a blessed thing left, except a half bottle of brandy, which my mother had given me, to be used in a dire emergency. So we set to and started building this boat. One of the difficulties was we made a framework of branches from an acacia tree. None of the branches of acacia trees are ever straight, so we had a rather difficult job. And we had a certain amount of rawhide thongs, so the frame was bound together with the rawhide thongs. We covered the frame with tarpaulin. First morning after the donkeys had been sent off, we went down to have a look at the boat which had been parked on the shore of the lake. Much to our dismay, we found the whole thing had collapsed. Jackals during the night had come along and they'd eaten all the rawhide thongs. So then it meant rebuilding this wretched boat. And we got no more rawhide thong, so we had to get the inner bark of acacia trees, which is very strong actually, but it's quite a job to get it collected. So finally we got the boat ready. About 3 o'clock one afternoon, we set off rowing.
So in a boat bound together by bark, they set off across the Jade Sea, notorious for its sudden, violent storms.
The boat had a tendency to go around in a circle. So it meant that one of us had to row harder than the one on the other side. When it got dark, we were right in the middle of the lake. It was a pretty dark night, there was not much moon, but we could see the outline of the hill on the other side of the lake. So we made for that. And we rowed and we rowed. We went on rowing it. And finally, I heard a noise and I said to Neville, I said, "What's that noise?" And he said, "I think it's the gale starting." So we redoubled our efforts. And then suddenly we hit the other shore. and the noise we'd heard was multitudes of frogs croaking. So then we landed, and then I thought, well, Joe, this is an emergency occurred. So he split the half bottle of brandy.
They had made the first recorded crossing of the Jade Sea, a remarkable feat even in the annals of African exploration. After that, George Adamson knew what he wanted, a life devoted to conservation as a warden in Kenya's game department, a life on safari. Even at Kora today, the safari life is never far away. The sanitary arrangements are simple. An upturned elephant jaw makes a comfortable seat, an old hunter's trick, George says. The shower is also simplicity itself. The sun heats the water, a chain and gravity do the rest. Primitive is perhaps the word for the open-air kitchen, presided over by Hamisi, a Sudanese. Like all good safari cooks, Hamisi can make a meal out of anything, or virtually nothing.
The fried bacon, arabu natia tomato, arabu baadaye napika macaroni. Tomato.
Hamisi has worked for George for over 30 years. The cubs are kept in a separate compound with plenty of shade. They're fed 3 times a day and are growing fast. When the white farmer who shot the mother for killing his cattle found she had cubs, he arranged, with the approval of the Wildlife Department, to fly them in his own plane to George at Kora. They were only about a week old when they first arrived, their eyes hardly open. If George hadn't accepted them, they might, if they'd been lucky, have gone to a zoo. Now they have a real chance of survival in the wild. George is a practiced wet nurse, looking after them devotedly, a sponge and water doing the job of their mother's tongue, even if not quite so effectively.
Come on.
2 months later, they doubled their weight. A young American girl, Carla Lerfelholtz from Minnesota, the latest in a long line of volunteers, arrived in Kora and immediately cast herself as his assistant.
Come on.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, just about every week they've been putting on about 2 pounds. 2 pounds a week.
Really?
The fact that the 3 cubs are orphans is an exact parallel of the story that made the Adamsons world famous. The story of Elsa, as told in Joy Adamson's book, Born Free. An Aryan beauty, Joy married George after a whirlwind romance. Born in Austria, she fell in love with Kenya and its wildlife. Joy loved going on safari with George, trekking for miles through the bush. They often took Elsa with them, and these were perhaps their happiest times together. Then the Adamsons moved to Meru Game Park, where they hoped to complete their experiment of raising a cub born in the wild and returning it to the wild. 30 years later, we took George back to Meru, to his old camp, now lost in the bush, where he and Joy had lived so happily with Elsa. I asked George why he'd sent Elsa's two sisters to a zoo in Europe.
I thought about keeping three, but I hadn't had the experience I have now. So we thought that the best thing would be to keep the one and send two of them to a suitable zoo. So that's what happened.
Why did you keep Elsa? Did she appeal to you?
She appeared to be the smallest and a bit of a runt at the time. So we thought we'd keep her.
The runt soon grew into a fine young lioness, Elsa in her prime. This remarkable film was taken by Joy and George themselves. Sometimes Elsa's playfulness was a bit overpowering.
She was very affectionate, that was one thing.
But also very strong. She must have weighed about 400 pounds then. I tried to get George to explain what he found so exceptional about her.
Some you can trust completely, like Elsa. Others you can't trust. Elsa happened to be one that you could trust. Every day we used to take her out for walks, and down the river and up the river. And we'd come across waterbuck and that sort of thing, and she'd learn to stalk them. And it was the same as the mother of a cub would do. Would take the cub out and let it exercise its inherited knowledge and become proficient. That's all we could do.
And then did you teach her how to kill?
They know that. You can't teach them. They know exactly what to do. Then finally she mated with a wild lion. Well, we knew that she was pregnant. And then we watched to see what would happen. And we knew when she gave birth. And she gave birth in a cleft in those rocks. And at first she wouldn't let anyone come near. In fact, it was she who really showed me where the cub was. I was searching that hill. After a bit, she'd look around and growl at me, so I think we were getting somewhere near the cub. So then I came back to camp and waited until Elsa came here for her food, and sneaked up there and went and had a look and found the cubs in the clefts.
Wasn't that a bit risky?
Well, if she'd found me, probably would be. But then after that, when the cubs became a little bit active, then she brought them down here. Joy was down at the river and Elsa was on the other side with the cubs. And she brought them across. And by then they were starting to swim. And you can see them coming across.
And she was actually bringing them to say,
Yeah.
to introduce them to you and Guy.
Yeah.
Joy's book, Born Free, describes the extraordinary relationship between man and lion. It became a runaway bestseller and later an Oscar-winning film. Elsa had changed their lives forever. George, she was like a sort of child, wasn't she, to you? Because neither you nor Joy had any children. Did she, in a way?
Yes, it took yes, that's true. Certainly.
So you became enormously fond of her?
Yes.
And then rather sad. I mean, she wasn't very old when she died, was she?
Yes, she's about 6 years old, I suppose. something like that.
What happened there?
Well, I found her on the other side of the river, a bit, about 400 or 500 yards down the river. And I once recognised that she was feeling pretty sick. Anyhow, I managed to get her across the river, and she came along and brought her to camp. And you could see that she was ill. And the next day, I remember, she came down here and she went into the river. And she stood in the river and was panting away the whole time. And then next thing was, as far as I remember, she came out and was sitting with me. And suddenly, you could, she started to sort of have fits. And next thing was, she died.
Elsa died of tick fever. Joy was away at the time, and it was left to George and his rangers to make a fitting grave for the little orphaned cub whose fame would soon spread across the world. They placed a simple plaque on the grave with the words Elsa, January 1956 to January 1961. George was upset to find the grave had been broken into. I asked him who could have done such a thing.
People who live near here, the Saraka, obviously they thought there must be something valuable in the grave. But it's not only once, but it's happened twice. Because when my wife died, her ashes were put here, and we repaired it. So this is the second time it's been desecrated.
All his life, George Adamson has been a tireless letter writer, corresponding regularly with friends and fans all over the world. He still keeps a diary and has written 2 autobiographies. But he finds it difficult to talk about his tempestuous marriage. What sort of a person was Joy Adamson?
She had well, you might describe it as an artistic temperament. She's not at all easy to get on. We used to have some terrible rows, but at the same time, we were very fond of each other.
What did you sort of row about?
Well, I don't... almost anything.
You had a disagreement about... she didn't like you taking a drink, did she, George? Didn't she? She didn't like you having...
Well, she thought, considered that I drank too much. I remember we had a house at Ischiola, that's my headquarters, and sometimes of an evening when I was there, I used to like to do a bit of carpentry, and I had this workshop fitted up, and on the upper shelf there was various things in empty whiskey bottles like turpentine and other things, including some rust remover. And it was my habit to fill up one of these bottles with a solution of whiskey and water, you see. And when I was planing some bit of wood or sawing or something, I'd reach up and get this bottle and have a swig, you see. On one occasion, I reached up and got and pulled the bottle and had a swig, and it happened to be rust remover. Thank God I didn't swallow it. the inside of my mouth was so for days.
You did have more serious disagreements. I mean, you had disagreement, I suppose, about Cora, didn't you? She didn't want to come here, and she also didn't altogether approve, did she, of your lions?
Yes, there was disagreement over that, and when it came to my having to find a place to take my lion, the only place was here in Cora, and I'd suggested that she should come and bring her leopards into the same area. At that time she had a leopard that she wanted to rehabilitate, but she didn't agree with that because she said it was too remote. She wouldn't come. She chose this place, Shaba, which from here would be about 100 miles. And then, of course, that had ended up with her being murdered. And if she'd agreed with my suggestion of coming to Cora, that would never have happened.
What happened exactly there, George?
Well, she was not very good with African labour. And there was a young Turkana who was working there. And she, I think with justification, thought that he'd stolen a camera. And she sacked him. And paid his wages sort of up to date. And he reckoned that he'd been badly treated, and some of these Turkana are a bit like that they harbour what they consider to be an injustice. And this fellow waylaid her in the evening when she went for a walk and killed her.
First reports were that she'd been killed by a lion. Is that right?
Yes, but I was convinced that it certainly couldn't have been a lion. And then later on, when the body was examined by competent people, it was obvious that she hadn't been mauled by a lion and had been murdered.
Paulie Kai, the former servant, was found guilty of her murder and jailed for life.
Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me.
We had always planned that eventually we'd retire to the property at Nabasha and spend the rest of our lives there.
After Joy's death in 1980, George returned to Cora and sought solace with his lions. In his years there, George has released more than 20 lions to the wild. Some were killed or disappeared, but he always tried to keep track of them. One day he went up to the rock to find two which had gone missing.
I went up and I was looking around, I couldn't find them, and I was about to go down again when suddenly these, the lion and lioness, Solomon and Sheba, appeared, and they were in a very playful mood. And while I was fending off, it was on a very steep slope this, and while I was fending off Sheba, this young lion, Solomon, jumped on my back. No, I couldn't keep my footing, and I sort of fell sitting down like that with him on top of me, and he grabbed hold of me by the neck, and then I had a stick and I tried to beat him off over my head like that, and that made him angry. He started to sink his teeth into the back of my neck. So he became more and more angry, and he was sinking his teeth in further and further. So I thought, well, if I don't do something, he's going to kill me. Luckily, I'd taken a revolver with me because I'd been looking around for these layers. And so while he was on top of me like this, I drew my revolver and I put it over my head. And I thought at first if I fired 2 shots over my head, that might put him off. But I pulled the trigger twice, and they were just 2 dark clicks. So then I thought, good God, I've forgotten to load this blasted thing. And I broke it open,